Welcome, everyone. I'm so delighted that you're all here. I'm Tita Chico. I'm professor of English at the University of Maryland and faculty director of the Center for Literary and Comparative Studies in the English department as well. Excuse me. We convene this year-long series on anti-racism to act on the various statements of solidarity for Black Lives Matter issued by the department, the college, and the university. We also convene this series to honor and to highlight the long-standing commitment among many English department faculty and students to anti-racist scholarship and teaching. To be clear, anti-racism is not an add-on in this series. It is the intellectual starting point for humanistic literary inquiry. Anti-racism is also a practice that leaves behind the platitudes of diversity and inclusion. As my colleague, Professor Zita Nunes writes, this is the time for asking who we are. George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Black Lives Matter. Jacob Blake, Daniel Prude, Black Lives Matter. We're meeting virtually today, but we are grounded by our institutional home, the University of Maryland. With this series, we honor and celebrate the memory of Second Lieutenant Richard Collins III, a young Black man who was about to graduate when, in 2017, he was murdered by a white supremacist at a campus bus stop. Second Lieutenant Richard Collins III, Black Lives Matter. We are meeting virtually today, but we are also grounded by the sedimented lands upon which the university stands. The grounds of the university are on what is known now as the state of Maryland, adjacent to the District of Columbia, the seat of the US federal government. But these grounds are the original homelands of the Anacostan and Piscataway tribal nations. The University of Maryland is dotted with buildings that name but forget this Indigenous history. The home of the English department for 20 years, Susquehanna Hall. Susquehanna comes from the Lenape for Oyster River. Also on campus, a dorm, Queen Anne's Hall. Yes, that Queen Anne, the 18th century Queen Anne, the period in which large-scale settler colonialism and genocide devastated tribal nations. And Washington, D.C., it is home to a football team named, until very recently, with a racial slur. For the Indigenous peoples still connected to this land on which we gather, to evoke the phrasing of Professor Eugenia Zarowski, the long 18th century has never ended. Yet how might anti-racism enable us to understand the long 18th century that has never ended, but understand it better, understand it more justly? Robin Wall Kimmerer, a botanist and a member of the citizen Potawatomi Nation, gives us a way by thinking through the plant sweetgrass. Sweetgrass, she writes, is passed from hand to earth to hand across years and generations. Sweetgrass, she tells us, thrives along the disturbed edges. Today, we are honored to think across years and generations and along these disturbed edges with our guests, Nikki Hessell, Robbie Richardson, and Megan Peiser. The Center's Anti-Racism series is co-sponsored by the University Libraries and by the Graduate School's Office of Diversity and Inclusion. Today's event is also sponsored by the Stringer Foundation and the Long 18th Lecture Series. With this support, we're able to commit to making these events accessible. Live captioning is available through the Typewell window, and the link is included in the chat below. For those of you on Twitter, our hashtags for conversation are hashtag antiracismUMD and hashtag CLCS_UMD. And please take a look at our website for the events that we have coming up this year. Thank you to Danielle, Griffin and Liam Daly, the Center's graduate assistants, and a very special thank you to Dr. Karen Nelson, the Center's co-director and director of research for the English department. Our program will be an hour. Our guests will be in conversation with each other for about 30 minutes, after which point my colleague Jason Rudy and I will come back to moderate the Q&A. We ask that you pose your questions in the Q&A function. Now, would you please join me in welcoming Nikki Hessell, Robbie Richardson, and Megan Peiser for Indigenous Studies and British Literatures. Thank you.
Halito. So hochifo yet Megan Peiser a chata oyo sia. My name is Megan Peiser, and I am a Choctaw woman. I would like to start us off today with a poem by a Choctaw storyteller, Esteline Tubby. She says, "We are clay people. We are a people of miracles. We have survived the walking. It is behind us. We have survived the blankets. They are the tattered cloth of the past. The dark dirt of Mississippi, the waters of Mississippi, the red clay of Oklahoma, they mingle with our bones. We are clay people. We are the people of miracles." I live and write from and teach within what is currently Detroit, Michigan, the traditional and ancestral lands of the Anishinaabe people, specifically the Three Fires Confederacy of the Odawa, the Ojibwe, and the Potawatomi. I recognize that my privilege of learning and teaching in this space is a result of the forcible removal of these Native and Indigenous peoples. And I commit to aligning my work with acts, words, and deeds that illustrate my solidarity with an acknowledgement of the sovereignty of these displaced tribes. I invite you, our guests, to drop the tribes, peoples, or occupied lands that you come to us from today in the chat so that we might think of what a world map looked like if it showed these lands instead of the boundaries of colonized settlers. It is an honor to be here today at the University of Maryland Center for Literary and Comparative Studies events on Antiracism, moderating a discussion with these two generous scholars and bringing Indigenous issues to the center of anti-racist conversations and initiatives. While reflecting on the title of this conversation, Indigenous Studies plus British Literatures, I am thinking about the way we define fields, spaces, ideas, knowledge, feelings, experiences, and land, all in colonialist ways. Indigenous peoples, our languages, our cultures, our governments, families, foodways, and relationships have been here for centuries longer than there was any such thing as British. In true decolonization work, Indigenous studies does not have to fit into or reconcile itself with the boundaries and goals of British literatures. No, indeed, it is the work of colonizing fields and studies to refit themselves within an Indigenous worldview. I cannot speak for all Native peoples. I am only a child of Choctaw Nation sitting amongst the Anishinaabe. But when I think of the ways that I talk to my community, even now via Zoom in my gardening group, I think of how very differently we roll this colonialist language around in our mouths and through our tongues, trying to get at the concepts we don't have words for, but know that our land tongues place within our hearts, trying to cite our knowledge when we only have colonialist citation systems. Many of you may know me, have talked to me, read my tweets, or heard me speak about my work on book history and digital humanities. But that is not the scholar that you see or hear before you today. That scholar performed the work of assimilation well. And it was a very small number of colleagues or even friends who knew which bubble I filled in when I indicated my race or ethnicity. We hide in plain sight on purpose. It is how we have survived. But do not mistake this for an absence of pride, a diminishing of our knowledge, or a lessened fervor for the importance of our people. As Nikki and Robbie will show you today, our ways, our needs, our presence, our voices are strong. But academia will have to think on how we will need to take up space in ways that are unfamiliar and uncomfortable in classrooms, in scholarships, and in your lives. In an Indigenous understanding of nonlinear time, we think on making choices for the next 7 generations. We think on how we are watched by our ancestors, but we also think and know how we are our ancestors right now, and how differently we might all act, be, know ourselves if we knew this as a truth of our world. Our 2 speakers today will be speaking to you about their work and their new exploration of their ideas. Our first speaker is Robbie Richardson, a Mi'kmaq and a member of the Pabinea First Nation in New Brunswick, Canada. After spending 7 years based in London, he's joined the English department at Princeton University. He specializes in 18th century literature and currently studies Indigenous material culture and its collection by European cultures. Nikki Hessell is a Pākehā settler scholar at Te Herenga Waka, University of Wellington, on the land of Ngatitoa Raganatira in Te Aotearoa in Aotearoa, New Zealand. She works on the intersection of Romantic studies and Indigenous studies. Robbie will be starting us off today.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for that, Megan. It's a wonderful introduction to some of the things that I think we're going to try to talk about today. Apologies in advance that I won't really be talking about necessarily my current research, but you know, we'll see how things go and what we can talk about afterwards. So hello, everyone. My name is Robbie Richardson. As Megan said, I am Mi'kmaq and a member of Pabinea First Nation in New Brunswick, Canada. This means that I am a status or registered Indian, according to Canada's Indian Act, paternalistic colonial legislation passed in 1876 and still structurally in place to govern much of First Nations life on reserve in Canada. In Canada, many non-Native people resentfully assume that Indian status grants us unearned rights to government handouts, no taxes, straightforward hunting and fishing rights, and a free university education. If only this were the case. The forebear of the Indian Act was called the Gradual Civilization Act, which can, if nothing else, be described as honestly named in its destructive intent. I mention this as a reminder that for Native people, settler colonialism, as the late Patrick Wolfe has helpfully written, is a structure and not an event. So I mostly grew up far away from Mi'kmaq, the unceded ancestral territory of my people on the East Coast, in Winnipeg, Manitoba, which has the largest Indigenous population of any city in Canada. Winnipeg is located on original lands of Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene people, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. I will always feel grateful and accountable to the Native people of that city. For the last 7 years, however, I've been based in London and teaching in the UK and Europe, not very many First Nations people around, and I'm now based out of Princeton on the traditional lands of the Lenni Lenape people, and I very much look forward to connecting with and learning from them once life hopefully returns to some kind of normalcy, which we don't need to talk about right now. My primary area of specialization is 18th century British literature, and I've mostly trained and taught in English departments, but I would like to discuss some of my thoughts on how we might approach Indigenous topics. Above all, if you take away anything from me, I believe that the most important thing to emphasize in both teaching and research is what I call, or what is called, Indigenous survivance. Survivance is a term that comes from Anishinaabe writer Gerald Weisner, one which is deliberately imprecise, a word that demands discussion and not definition, but that implies, in Weisner's words, an active sense of presence over absence, deracination and oblivion. Survivance is the continuance of stories, not a mere reaction, however pertinent. Survivance stories are renunciations of dominance, detractions, obtrusions, the unbearable sentiments of tragedy and the legacy of victimry. So the first time that I was on a roundtable discussing how to bring Native issues and perspectives into research and the classroom was in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan in 2007. Nearby, Canada's last residential school, the notorious Gordon Indian Residential School, had closed just 11 years prior in 1996. I was closer historically then to that project of cultural genocide than to this moment now. Since that roundtable, I have seen some shifts. The Idle No More movement, the rallying around and violent suppression of Standing Rock in the States, and the release of the report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada. This has brought about a response across Canada, and institutions and individuals have been making efforts at change in some form. Funding bodies are now looking for Indigenous content, and many scholars, particularly non-Native scholars, are now turning to Indigenous and adjacent topics. And Native people have become not just subjects of derision, disdain, or perhaps pity, as was what I saw growing up in Winnipeg, but now as deserving of justice and even holders of knowledge key for the survival of the planet itself. As Lakota historian Nick Estes declares in the title of his recent book on resistance to the Dakota Access Pipeline, our history is the future. But it has to be said that the material conditions for First Nations people since 2007 are relatively unchanged, despite this rise in consciousness from non-Native people, despite Canada's formal apology for residential schools, despite the findings of the TRC, and despite the widespread adoption of land acknowledgements across Canadian schools, the cultural sector, and beyond, which might give us pause in thinking about how gestural politics need to be transformed into broader systemic rather than individualized critique and action, or otherwise they ultimately become a tool of the neoliberal university, of liberal-minded careerists, and of settler colonial society itself. In Winnipeg, where land acknowledgements by schools, universities, art galleries, and so forth have become a prevalent part of life, 31% of Indigenous people still live below the poverty line. Winnipeg police killed 3 Native people in separate incidents over 10 days in April, including 16-year-old Aisha Hudson. As Frantz Fanon writes in The Wretched of the Earth, let us admit it, the settler knows perfectly well that no phraseology can be a substitute for reality. Or perhaps as Cree geographer Michelle Daigle has recently argued, colonial power gets reproduced through spectacles and good-feeling reconciliation mandates implemented by Canadian post-secondary institutions. Reconciliatory rhetoric relegates colonialism to the past, creating the illusion that Canada has somehow entered a renewed era with Indigenous people that is amicable. Yellowknives Dene scholar Glenn Coulthard's work warns us that discursive forms of recognition are used, in Daigle's words, to depoliticize Indigenous self-determination and to secure access and ownership of Indigenous lands. Mohawk anthropologist Audra Simpson similarly warns against spectacles of settler sorrow as weapons of colonial governance. In his 1969 book, Custer Died for Your Sins, an Indian Manifesto, Lakota thinker Vine Deloria Jr. wrote, academia and its byproducts continues to become more irrelevant to the needs of people. The rest of America had better beware of having little quaint mores that will attract anthropologists, or it will soon become victim of the conceptual prison into which Indians have been thrown. In her 1999 book, Decolonizing Methodologies, Research and Indigenous Peoples, Maori professor Linda Tuhiwai Smith notes that research is one of the dirtiest words in the Indigenous world's vocabulary. It is implicated in the worst excesses of colonialism. These thinkers remind us that for Indigenous people, scholarly inquiry is a complex and fraught endeavor, and has rarely benefited us or our communities. We think of our relatives' bones in museum drawers, and of our most sacred objects on display for tourists. We think of literary scholarship as the theft of our stories and of our experiences. And while it's clear that in recent decades, decolonial research that centers Indigenous epistemologies is having a resurgence, we mustn't confuse this with the insurgency that would be required to actually benefit Native people. How might the attempted reform of universities and museums, their decolonization, their indigenization, actually be propping up the structure of settler colonialism? And what can we do differently? To briefly return to my roundtable of 2007, I spoke then about my recently completed MA dissertation on British captivity narratives from the 7 Years' War and the difficulty I found in finding any sites of Indigenous agency in the texts I was working on. Their violence, their cruelty, their pathological racism made them profoundly alienating, to say the least, though at the same time interpretively rich. I think that many scholars of the 18th century have discovered similar experiences. But another First Nations academic on the roundtable, Saulteaux scholar Janice Ekus, noted that I needed to seriously reconsider what I meant by text in my work if I was going to find agency and sovereignty in historical literature. And this was the impetus for my turn to Indigenous material culture. Nikki's work helpfully shows us also that periodization is conceptually inadequate for Indigenous studies. I think more generally, we need to interrogate the categories of text and of literature itself in approaching Indigenous topics. We need to consult and involve local Indigenous communities in our teaching, and ultimately to seriously consider and engage with Indigenous knowledge beyond feel-good gestures. And I'll leave it there for now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Robbie. Nikki, will you take it away?
Kia ora koutou, ngā mihi nui kia koutou. Ko Nikki Hessell tōku ingoa no whakatane ahau. He Pākehā ahau, e noho ana ahau I te whenua o Ngāti Tua Rangatira me Te Aotearoa. No Ingarangi me Kotirana me Tine Maka o Kutepuna. My name's Nikki Hessell, and I've just given a short Pākehā, a description of myself, mapping myself onto the land here and to my own ancestors. I'm really grateful to Tita, Jason, Danielle, Liam, Karen, everyone at UMD for the invitation today, and very pleased to be in conversation with two brilliant Indigenous scholars. I think Robbie's just outlined the importance of settlers, in my case a Pākehā settler, that's the Māori word for a New Zealander of European descent, not taking up the space of Indigenous communities, activists, intellectuals, and I'm really glad to be outnumbered in terms of our conversation today. I'm just going to read a short piece, which is the preface to a new project called Sensitive Negotiations, Indigenous Diplomacy and British Romantic Poetry. It's a book about diplomacy in quotation, partly I think to draw out four things that I think will connect to what Megan and Robbie have been saying. First of all, the need to place yourself in your research and to take ownership of that role in research, including as a settler, what is your place, if any, in this research. Secondly, being a good treaty partner. That's a very common narrative of settler scholarship in Aotearoa, New Zealand, but I think it's one that's useful across the colonised world, using that as a guiding principle for research and teaching. Thirdly, focusing on what Indigenous communities are actually doing and needing right now in the 21st century, but also what the history of that doing and needing is, and moulding our research towards that rather than applying from the outside what we imagine Indigenous communities might want. And fourthly, taking those methodologies from within Indigenous epistemologies so that we're learning from scholars like Linda Tuhiwai-Smith, who Robbie just mentioned, in terms of what are the methodologies that are actually appropriate. And if you don't know how to use those methodologies, maybe this work is not for you and it's time to sit down. So I'm just going to read this preface briefly, and I hope that this helps sort of start some conversation and connect to what Robbie just said. Perhaps appropriately for a book about quotation, this book was born out of another book. In the years in which I was working on the project Romantic Literature in the Colonised World, Lessons from Indigenous Translations, I would occasionally come across examples where Indigenous intellectuals and writers quoted British Romantic poetry in the original English. Because I was looking for translations, and because I considered the urgent intervention needed in my field of Romantic studies to be one around bilingualism and multilingualism, I didn't think much about what these examples in English meant. During the same period of time, my partner was involved on behalf of his iwi, or tribe or nation, in negotiations with the government to settle a claim under the Treaty of Waitangi, the 1840 document which ushered in the modern nation state of Aotearoa, New Zealand. Because this process involved an enormous amount of time and frequent travel back to the traditional centre of his community, the negotiations became a core feature of our lives. Work and family time was organised around his absences, and the gradual process of settling the claim was woven into our timelines and our conversations. Two things stood out to me as I watched these events unfold. One was that because the Crown, and that's the term we use in New Zealand to describe the government in its treaty negotiation process, because the Crown controls the process, the negotiators always had to make use of the language and what we in literary studies would call the forms that the Crown chose to recognise. In order to communicate and connect with the Crown negotiators, mātauranga Māori, that is Māori knowledge, had to be processed via these languages and forms. And being a skilled negotiator meant comprehending how to do this processing. Ideas and histories that came out of this land and its people had to be connected somehow to the Crown's own cultural understandings of the relevant relationships and processes. This involves something more than simply expressing oneself in English. It means instead understanding at a deep level what values are cherished by the Crown and what languages and forms from within the Crown's cultural frames of reference can be effectively mobilised to make the necessary arguments. It means knowing which English texts and vocabularies to use, in what form and when, in order to hold the Crown to account. Mostly, this meant quoting the Crown's words or forms back to itself, in order to remind it of past obligations and undertakings, or simply to fit a model that made sense. But the second thing that stood out to me was how narrowly the Crown interpreted what constituted the negotiation, compared to how capacious it seemed on the other side. And I'm just going to digress a minute and say Robbie's point about what are the texts, what things do we consider to be texts is so crucial here. It wasn't simply that the Crown controlled all the languages and all the forms, in other words. It was that the range of languages and forms they considered relevant was so limited. Only some of the words mattered. Only some of the talking was important. Only some of the texts carried weight. But from where I was standing, everything was diplomacy. Every word and every text was part of the negotiation. It was not difficult then to look with fresh eyes at the scholarly material I'd been collecting and see that this habit of poetic quotation that I'd observed in historical texts was invariably part of a much wider diplomatic process. Like my partner and his fellow negotiators, these Indigenous writers and leaders were trying to find forms and languages from within settler imperial worldviews and cultural canons in order to communicate. But they retained the right to include any and all genres in that communication. It was all diplomacy, not just every treaty or every petition, but every line of verse. It was all geared towards a restitution of land, sovereignty, and self-determination. On the day that my partner's iwi finally signed a deed of settlement with the Crown, the negotiators asked if any of the rangatahi, that is the young people, would like to come up and sign. My eldest son, who was only 9 at the time, went up and wrote his name, just his first name, Kohirangi, like he was a 19th century chief who didn't need to concern himself with surnames. He was not only confident in his right to sign the deed, but in his right to represent himself as he saw fit. That name, Kohirangi, situated him in that place and explained who his ancestors were. The Crown would simply have to accept it. Some months later, he brought home a poem he had written in his English class. This class was the only class he had in English in his schooling at that time, because he'd been in Māori immersion all the way through. So this was his one English class. The poem was called The Moon, and it ended with the line, "In the forests of the night." I was surprised to see a line from William Blake in his work, especially as this was meant to be an original poem. I asked him why he'd included it, and he said that it was his starting point and his aim. He decided before he began writing that he wanted that particular line to be in there. To him, there was nothing unoriginal about this choice, nor was it something that signaled his assimilation into another literary tradition. It was the line that was needed at the time. Sometimes you write in Māori, and sometimes you write in English. Sometimes you communicate one way of being, and sometimes another. Sometimes you sign a settlement deed, and sometimes you write a poem. It's all diplomacy. It's all in negotiation. Thanks.
Well, I love that. I love hearing about your son and the power that he finds in his name. A thread that I'm seeing connected here that I think picks up on a lot that we have been thinking about, certainly at various institutions worldwide here, is how do we deal with this language and concept disconnect that our peoples throughout history have had to, as Nikki noted, always map our understandings and our language onto concepts, language, and power structures of settler colonialists. And I think this is something that we see a lot when we're only looking, as Nikki notes, at certain kinds of texts, usually the texts that we're trained with. Certainly when my students look at historic treaties and they think this must be so hard for the Indigenous peoples. And I just want to crack that open and say, there's so much more than just language here. And I think it connects a lot to what Robbie brought up about his new work and exploring other ways of finding Indigenous peoples, of seeing power in Indigenous peoples, but also how we're having to do this delicate negotiation as scholars looking at these things, especially as Tina noted that for Indigenous peoples, it is still the 18th century. We are still experiencing settler colonialism. We are still looking at those maps in our classroom with the boundaries made by white men. And I wonder if I could take this bridge, this moment, to ask Robbie to talk about his new work and the things, the objects that he's looking at, the power he finds behind them, and how he's negotiating having to present his work so frequently to settler colonialist audiences.
Yeah, well, thanks for that, and thanks, Nikki. You know, incidentally, the way that Nikki and I met was through Indigenous diplomacy, because my sister, who is, I guess, a government official and an Indigenous woman, met her husband in New Zealand. So, and then they sort of got to talking, and they were like, "Oh, well, we do similar work." Kind of a small world, isn't it? A small Indigenous world. But yeah, I'm still negotiating all that stuff about how to sort of read these materials. But what really kind of inspired me, besides that moment, that humbling moment when I was in a roundtable as an MA student, getting sort of called out for my Eurocentric preference of texts, was there's a famous treaty negotiations with the Onondaga from the 1740s. And the Onondaga leader, Kanasatago, says, you know, the big problem right now is what's happening at that table. And he points to the secretary who's writing. And he says, it's that pen and ink work that's really messing us up. And so I kind of got to thinking, like, well, what would Kanasatago had preferred? And of course, what he would have preferred at that time would have been wampum exchange and of a sort of more fluid understanding of relationships. And so I think, you know, to consider, this is what I meant by, you know, considering other forms of text, is what that text sort of demands of the world and how we see the world. How, so something like wampum, which is, you know, beads made of marine animal that are then strung and sort of read by people to record treaty exchanges, to record various things. Kind of a lot of it's sort of unreadable now to look at those original documents because the oral tradition is lost. But basically, these were just such a fundamental different way of understanding the 18th century. And so I'm just sort of interested in seeing how we can sort of make that speak to our understanding of the 18th century, like the, not our, but
Yeah, I'm really interested in the question of kind of multiple literacies through exactly what Robbie's talking about in terms of objects and the broad array of texts that make up well, in the terms I'm thinking of, a negotiation, but it could be anything, a canon, an archive. What makes that up? And probably the thing that I find coming out of my own study of this mobilization of English poetry, of English text, is that the importance of not falling into the trap of thinking that that is assimilationist or colonized, that's a colonized mind at work. What I see is this just incredible agency that involves not just literacy across a first Indigenous language plus English, but all the objects Robbie's talking about, being literate in wampum, being literate in waiata, being literate in carving, being literate in weaving, you know, all of these literacies at work. And the importance of that cross-cultural literacy to being able to make yourself be understood. So on the one hand, I think, like Megan's saying, with the treaty documents, that must have been a very unfamiliar form in lots of ways, and is so disempowering because it puts so much power into the idea of the written word and the document that Crown negotiators or government officials are drawing up. But also that question of really extraordinary agency to bring those literacies all to bear in different moments. And I'm, you know, couldn't agree more with what Robbie's saying, that if what we understand as the 18th century, even if we're understanding on British literary terms, is just text in English, we've missed a whole world's worth of text knowledges, understandings that are live in that moment, and the people living in that moment needed to understand both sides of those. You know, lots of Crown officials and government officials did understand the importance of wampum from that side, even though they couldn't read it. But it also live current things in the present day. I think there's a real danger in pushing this to the past and saying, well, that was then, but this is now. Just looking at what's happening at 1492 Landback Lane, where the Grand River Six Nations have had to stand up again to defend an 18th century British document that says, this will be your land in perpetuity. So this is not back in the mists of time. This is very much the period that we study. And right today, you have people being arrested. You have people having to go and explain to the Canadian public why this is important. So that continuity of lived Indigenous experience in the here and now, I think, is really important to those conversations too, about what are the texts and why do we consider them to be important.
I love that. Thanks so much, Nikki, for reminding us how these texts are living texts. And I think that's something that is new perhaps for our classroom, but not new for our passion as instructors or as scholars. We believe in the power of the text that we study, and remembering that these are alive, that we are calling on these treaties, that we as peoples living on land that is perhaps not our own. I am a settler here in what is currently Detroit. This is not where my tribe is from. And it is my responsibility to live by the treaty of the place where I live. So we have to, as responsible citizens, be reading the treaties and honoring them, even in our daily lives.